What if you have never actually been awake? Not even once in your entire life? What if every dream you chased, every fear you carried, and every identity you built was never yours to begin with, but a carefully constructed sleep designed by forces that feed on the one thing you were never supposed to remember? There is a moment most people never notice. It arrives quietly, somewhere between the alarm going off and the first thought of the day, before the mind fills with plans, obligations, and the endless noise of a life being managed. There is a fraction of a second where something vast and silent stirs beneath the surface. Something older than memory. Something that does not belong to the name you were given, the job you were assigned, or the story you were handed the moment you were born into this world. Most people never pause long enough to feel it, and that is not an accident. For thousands of years, buried beneath centuries of silence and deliberate erasure, certain teachings carried a vision of the human condition so radical, so deeply unsettling, that entire civilizations mobilized to destroy it. Not because it was dangerous in the way weapons are dangerous, but because it was dangerous in the way a single lit match is dangerous inside a room that has been filled with gas for generations. The teaching was simple. You are asleep. You have always been asleep. And the sleep was not something that happened to you. It was something that was built around you, layer by layer, long before you arrived. The ancient Gnostics, those quiet, hunted communities of seekers scattered across Egypt, Syria, and the edges of the Roman world in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, did not describe the human condition as sinful. They described it as dreaming. Their cosmology was not a theology of guilt and punishment. It was a map of a trap, a precise, almost architectural account of how awareness gets folded inward, compressed, narrowed, and convinced that it is small, that it is only a body, that it is only a name, that it is only a story moving through time toward an ending it cannot control. When the sealed clay jars discovered near the cliffs of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt in 1945 were finally opened and translated, what emerged was not mythology in the distant sense. It was not the kind of story that belongs only to another era and another people. It read, as many scholars quietly noted, like a diagnosis. Like someone had looked directly at the architecture of the modern human mind, the anxiety, the craving, the compulsive distraction, the hollow exhaustion behind every achievement, and had written it all down 2,000 years before it became the defining experience of a civilization. The text spoke of a world shaped not by the highest source of being, but by something lesser, something that had become separated from that source, and in its separation had lost the ability to perceive anything beyond itself. The Gnostics called this figure the Demiurge, not a devil in the traditional sense, not a figure of pure malice, something stranger and, in many ways, more troubling than malice. A craftsman of reality who genuinely believed himself to be the only God, because he had never seen anything beyond the reflection of his own limited light. And from that blindness, a world took shape. Dense, convincing, beautiful in places, but built, at its foundation, on a fundamental distortion of what is real. Around this figure, the text described attendant forces, intelligences woven into the fabric of the material world, each governing a particular layer of the constructed reality. The Gnostics called them Archons. The word itself simply means rulers. But these were not rulers in the political sense. There was something more intimate than that. They were described as the mechanisms through which consciousness is kept in place, through which the sleeping giants, the vast, luminous sparks of original awareness trapped inside human form, remain convinced that the dream is all there is. Think carefully about that image for a moment. A sleeping giant, not a small thing, lulled into unconsciousness by accident or weakness. Something enormous. Something that, if it were ever to fully stir, would change the entire landscape of the world it wakes inside. The Gnostic tradition insisted that this was precisely what every human being carried at their core. Not a flawed creature in need of redemption, but a fragment of something so vast and so luminous that the architecture of the constructed world could not contain it once it began to remember itself. The sleep was not a punishment. It was a necessity for the dream to hold. The dreamer could not be allowed to wake. This is where the ancient teaching becomes something more than cosmology, something more than philosophy, because the question it places quietly on the table in front of you is not abstract. It is the most personal question that has ever been asked. What exactly is keeping you asleep? Not metaphorically, not in the soft, agreeable sense that spirituality often uses the word, but literally. What are the precise mechanisms through which the awareness you carry is kept from recognizing itself? What are the specific channels through which the sleeping giant inside you is kept heavy, kept confused, kept convinced that the dream is reality? The old texts had answers. Answers that, when you set them beside the texture of modern life, carry a weight that is almost impossible to dismiss. The Archons in the Gnostic system did not operate through violence. They did not need to. Violence is a crude instrument, and crude instruments leave marks. What the Archons administered, according to the ancient accounts, was far more elegant. They governed through the management of attention, through the careful cultivation of states, fear, craving, shame, comparison, the endless hunger for approval, that keep consciousness perpetually oriented outward, perpetually chasing, perpetually arriving at the next moment only to find that the completion it promised has somehow moved just a little further ahead. If that description feels familiar, it should, because the civilization you are living inside has constructed, with extraordinary precision, an entire infrastructure dedicated to exactly that effect. Every notification designed to interrupt stillness. Every headline engineered to detonate a small burst of fear or outrage. Every platform built on the careful measurement of insecurity, feeding back to you exactly the images and comparisons most likely to keep you hungry, restless, and unable to sit quietly with yourself for more than a few minutes at a time. The Gnostics did not have a word for social media. They did not need one. They had already described the principle behind it with complete accuracy 2,000 years ago. Whatever keeps the dreamer dreaming serves the dream. Whatever scatters attention away from the interior silence where the sleeping giant stirs, that is the Archon in its modern form. But here is the part of the teaching that most people, even those who encounter it, find genuinely difficult to sit with. The deepest layer of the archonic system is not external. The mechanisms of the external world, the noise, the spectacle, the manufactured urgency, are only effective because they connect to something already running inside. The Gnostic texts describe the Archons not merely as forces outside the individual, but as patterns woven into perception itself. Habits of seeing, reflexes of a mind, the automatic voice that reaches for doubt the moment something in you begins to open, the sudden exhaustion that arrives the instant you approach stillness, the inexplicable resistance that surfaces when you try to ask the questions that actually matter. The Apocryphon of John, one of the most complete texts recovered from the Nag Hammadi collection, describes the construction of a human form in precise, almost clinical language. Layer upon layer, the Archons build their structures directly into the architecture of the body and the mind, not as external chains, but as internal tendencies, as the baseline orientation of a consciousness that has been taught, from its first moment of arrival into this world, to look outward for everything it needs. For worth, for meaning, for the confirmation that it exists and matters. And in that constant outward orientation, the inward recognition, the moment the sleeping giant begins to feel its own weight, to sense the vastness it carries, is perpetually deferred, always arriving at the next moment, always just around the next corner of achievement or acquisition or understanding. The Nag Hammadi texts return to this theme again and again with a consistency that feels less like religious doctrine and more like the careful documentation of a pattern that the writers had observed directly, in themselves, in the communities around them, In the long history of a humanity that kept building civilizations dedicated to the chase of something that the chase itself guaranteed could never be found. The Gnostic Sophia, whose name carries the full weight of wisdom, not as an abstract quality, but as a living intelligence, is described in these accounts as the force within creation that cannot forget its origin entirely. The trace of the pleroma, the original fullness from which all awareness emerges, embedded in the very fabric of the world that was shaped without her consent. She is the restlessness you feel at 3 in the morning when the noise has finally stopped and something ancient stirs beneath the surface of your thoughts. She is the inexplicable grief that arrives without cause in the middle of an ordinary day. She is the sense, quiet and persistent and impossible to fully silence, that something essential is missing from the story you have been living. And the sleeping giants, the vast compressed awareness trapped inside human experience, carry her signal whether they know it or not. The ancient accounts describe this inner trace as the divine spark, the pneuma, a fragment of the original light folded into the density of the material world, neither destroyed by it nor fully submerged in it, but waiting, patient with the peculiar patience of something that knows it cannot be extinguished, only forgotten. And forgetting, the text insists, is not the same as loss. Forgetting is the mechanism of the dream. It is the first and most essential tool of the Archonic system, because a sleeping giant that has forgotten what it is will cooperate fully with every structure built to keep it sleeping. It will not need to be coerced. It will coerce itself. It will police its own awakening with a ferocity that no external authority could match, because it will have internalized the dream so completely that the dream will feel like identity, like selfhood, like the only thing standing between it and the terrifying emptiness of not knowing who it is without the story it was given. This is the central insight that the Gnostic tradition spent centuries attempting to preserve through fire and suppression and the slow erosion of institutional erasure. Not that the world is evil, not that the body is a prison to be escaped, but that the identification, the deep, compulsive, unconscious conviction that you are the story, that you are the fear, that you are the role, that you are the accumulated weight of everything that has been piled on top of the sleeping giant since the moment it arrived. That identification is the dream, and the dream is not yours. It was handed to you, constructed around you, maintained by every mechanism of a world that requires your unconsciousness in order to continue operating exactly as it does. The men and women who gathered in the silence of Egyptian desert communities and Syrian house schools, passing these texts between them and the knowledge that discovery meant death, were not engaged in theoretical philosophy. They were engaged in something far more urgent. They were attempting, in the language available to them, to describe a technology of waking up. Not waking up in the soft, decorative sense that the word has acquired in contemporary usage. Not a lifestyle. Not an identity to adopt or a community to join or a set of beliefs to absorb and display. Something more radical than any of those things. The actual, irreversible recognition of what the sleeping giant is. What was before the dream closed around it. What remains untouched beneath every layer the Archonic system has built. When the Roman Empire aligned itself with an emerging institutional church in the 4th century of the Common Era, the decision about what would survive and what would be destroyed was not made on theological ground alone. It was made on the grounds of control. A teaching that located ultimate authority within the individual, that said the sacred was not the exclusive property of priests or emperors or the institutions that mediated between the human and the divine, was not merely heretical. It was structurally incompatible with the project of empire. And so the texts were condemned. The communities were scattered. The language of the inner life was carefully rerouted toward obedience, toward institutional mediation, toward a relationship with the divine that required a permanent human intermediary with the authority to grant or withhold access. But the sleeping giants do not disappear because their language is taken from them. The inner pressure does not stop simply because the tradition that gave it a name is destroyed. it surfaces differently. In the alchemical symbolism of medieval Europe, encoding in the language of metals and transformations a cosmology that could not be spoken plainly. In the mystical traditions of every culture that found ways to preserve the core recognition beneath the institutional structures that surrounded them. In the inexplicable longing that has driven certain individuals in every generation to look past the surface of the given world and ask the question that the system most requires them not to ask. What is this, really? What am I actually? What was here before the dream? And now, in an era when distraction has reached a level of refinement that no previous civilization could have imagined, the sleeping giants stir again. Not because of any external event or any prophetic calendar, but because the pressure of the inner light, patient beyond all imagining, has been building for longer than history can measure. You can feel it in the collective restlessness, in the way that achievement no longer satisfies the way it once promised to, in the way that the noise keeps needing to be louder and faster and more consuming, as if something inside the dream itself knows that the silence it is covering is becoming harder to contain. Every system that depends on your unconsciousness must work harder to maintain it, as the sleeping giant begins, however slowly, however tentatively, to shift its weight. The ancient teaching did not offer a rescue. It did not promise that an external force would arrive to dissolve the dream on your behalf. What it offered was something both simpler and more demanding than rescue. It offered recognition, the moment of genuine seeing, not the accumulation of more information about the dream, but the direct, unmediated recognition of the dreamer was described as gnosis. Not belief, not faith in a doctrine or a system or an authority. Knowing, in the oldest and most intimate sense of the word. The moment the sleeping giant becomes aware of its own weight. The moment the dream is seen as a dream, not from outside it, but from within it. And in that seeing, something that no archonic system has ever been able to fully prevent begins to move. You are not behind. You're not broken. You're not a small thing that has somehow fallen short of what it was supposed to be. You are a sleeping giant in the first moments of stirring. And the very fact that these ideas find a place to land inside you, that they feel less like new information and more like the return of something you already carried, is not coincidence. It is the pressure of the light inside you, doing exactly what it has always done, finding the crack, moving toward the surface. You do not have to force what is already moving on its own. If something in this reflection stayed with you, if a single image or idea found the place inside you where the sleeping giant lives, then you already know that this is not about entertainment. This channel exists for the ones who have stopped accepting the surface version of reality. If that is you, stay connected. Every exploration that follows goes one layer deeper into the hidden architecture of this world and the buried knowledge of what you truly are. Subscribe now and do not miss what comes next, because the next piece of this map was almost erased from history entirely.